This is Ashley Day, inviting you once again to join us as we seek to answer the question, what does the Bible say? Let's take our Bibles now and turn to John chapter 15. John chapter 15. The last phrase of chapter 14 alerts us to a change in venue. Chapter 13 verse 12 says, "So after he had washed their feet and had taken his garments and had sat down again, he said to them." And from that point until the close of chapter 14, Jesus and his disciples were seated around the Passover table, and Jesus spoke the words which we've been studying during the last 4 sessions. Finally, at the end of chapter 14, verse 31, Jesus said, "Arise, let us go hence." So we must assume that at that point they left the upper room and they began to walk toward the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. It was already night, but there would have been sufficient light within the city to see their way around. Something they saw on their way probably triggered the parable or the analogy that Jesus used to teach his disciples further. Perhaps it was a vine growing over a wall somewhere. Or maybe it was the beautiful golden vine that was sculptured onto the temple gates. Nobody knows. But Jesus was a master at turning objects and events into visual aids. And in all probability, that is what he did on this particular occasion. He may have paused beside a vine or the temple gate and pointed it out to his disciples as he spoke. He may have used it as an object lesson. In any case, the accent of the first sentence is on the word true. True. Verse 1, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman." The sense is that although others may claim to be the vine, he alone was the true one. In John chapter 6 and verse 32, Jesus used the same construction when he said, "I am the true bread." On that occasion, he was answering the Jews' claim that Moses had given them bread from heaven, referring, of course, to the manna in the wilderness, and he was stressing that the manna was only a type, only a picture, and that he, in fact, was the true bread. In other words, Jesus was making a contrast between that which claimed to be and that which was. What then was the vine to which Jesus contrasted himself? Well, throughout the Old Testament, God spoke of Israel as the vine. For instance, in Psalm 80, verse 8, it says, "Thou hast brought a vine out of Egypt. Thou hast cast out the heathen and planted it." An obvious reference to Israel. And then in verse 14 of the same psalm it says, "Return, we beseech thee, O God of hosts. Look down from heaven, and behold, visit this vine." In Isaiah 5, we read the famous passage describing the failure of Israel to respond to her planter. It says, "Now I will sing of my well-beloved, a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My beloved hath a vineyard on a very fruitful hill. And he fenced it, and gathered out the stones thereof, and planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it, and also made a winepress therein. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. Now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, between me and my vineyard. What could I have done more to my vineyard that I have not done? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes." Jeremiah 2:21 is similar. It says, "Yet I planted thee a noble vine, wholly a right seed. How then art thou turned into the degenerate plant of a strange vine unto me?" Ezekiel 17, 1 through 10 says more or less the same thing. Hosea 10:1 says, "Israel is an empty vine. He brings forth fruit to himself. According to the multitude of his fruit, he has increased the altars. According to the goodness of his land, they have made goodly images. And so on. Those are just a few of many references to the fact that the vine was intended to be Israel. But it had gone wrong. It had gone wild. The conversation that Jesus had with the Jewish leaders in chapter 8, if you remember, illustrates how much store they placed on the fact that they were the sons of Abraham. They'd been raised to believe that because they belonged to Israel, that they automatically had favor with God. As Jews, even the disciples had been taught that. They also had grown up with the idea that salvation was a matter of inheritance because they were part of Israel. And Jesus wanted them to understand that such was not the case. And so possibly pausing by the vine or the symbol of a vine, he taught them this parable. I am the true vine. I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman or the vine dresser. Verse 2, every branch in me that bears not fruit, he takes away. And every branch that bears fruit, he purges it, that it may bring forth more fruit. You know, vine has very little use other than for bearing fruit. It's a rapid grower and it can get out of hand very quickly. We have a grapevine growing over our deck, and I seem to spend much of the summer trying to keep it from swallowing up the house. The interesting thing is that the more you allow it to grow, the smaller the fruit becomes, and vice versa. The secret of fruit seems to be keeping it cut back. Of course, from the vine's point of view, that's not a lot of fun. Who wants to be pruned? Much more pleasant to grow freely, crawling all over everything without being checked in its progress. But if it bore only fruit, or only leaves rather, and tiny little currant-sized grapes, what would be the reason for its existence? And we're all like that as well. What is the reason for our existence? Why do we exist? Why does God leave us here on this earth? Certainly not to grow wild like Israel had done, taking up space but yielding no return. You see, a vine is like an investment. Work and effort is put into it solely with a view to reaping a harvest. If there were no harvest, the work and the effort would be a waste of time, and the plant should be discarded. The question arises, what fruit is Jesus referring to here? If he is the vine and they were the branches, then what kind of harvest was expected? Well, in the previous chapter, Jesus had told them, if you remember, that after he went away, he would send another comforter, just like him, the Holy Spirit, to dwell within them. And as we shall see in verse 5, he also explained that the fruit would not be anything that the disciples could produce themselves. Therefore, it would be the fruit of the Spirit, not the fruit of the disciples. Well, the fruit of the Spirit is very clearly defined for us in Galatians 5:22 and 23, isn't it? The fruit of the Spirit, it says, is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and self-control. Being a descendant of Abraham wouldn't produce those things in the individual. Neither would education or rank or wealth. Those things are not the natural attributes of man. They are the attributes of Christ. And only the Spirit of Christ can produce them in the human personality. Oh yes, there are people who seem to be naturally long-suffering, naturally gentle, naturally meek. But these characteristics are not the same as those which the Spirit produces, often contrary to that person's nature. The love and the joy and the peace and the faith which are produced by the Spirit within an individual can't be duplicated by human temperament. They're the fruit of the Spirit, not the fruit of the man. So Jesus was telling his disciples that he, not Israel, was the true vine, and only as his life flowed through them would they produce his fruit. Now, many people stumble over verse 2, where Jesus says, "Every branch in me that bears not fruit, he taketh away." Now, they point to it as evidence that people could be saved and then lose their salvation because they didn't produce fruit. The problem with this view is that it does violence to many other passages of Scripture, which tell us very clearly that salvation is a gift of grace and does not depend upon the individual's track record. Also, it's not true in fact, because the Father does not take away those who are unfruitful. Jesus specifically said, "Let both," that is, the wheat and the tares, "grow together until the harvest." This passage is a parable, and like all parables, we must be careful not to dwell too heavily on any specific part of it. Parables are intended to teach a general truth, which can be damaged if we overinterpret all the details. General picture is that the church is like a great vine with Christ as the central trunk, and all the branches drawing their life from him. Life inevitably produces fruit. The branch cannot produce fruit on its own. It can't decide when and where and how it will bear. It simply facilitates the work of the life within it and bears the fruit, supports it, and acts as a kind of umbilical channel through which the life of the vine flows to nurture it. It's a clothes hanger, if you like, to hold up the fruit. It's interesting to note that the word translated "takes away," he takes it away, is ero, which is used many times in the New Testament. The lexicon tells us that although it is sometimes used in the sense of removing, its primary meaning is not that at all. It means to lift, to raise, to bear, to carry, to take up. The NIV translates it "cuts off," which is pure interpretation and has no connection with the word at all. Here are some examples of how it's used in the New Testament. Matthew 4:6 says, "They," that is the angels, "shall bear you up." Matthew 14:20 says, "They took up the fragments." That's when he fed the 5,000. Matthew 27:32 says they compelled Simon to carry the cross, to bear the cross. Mark 2:3 says the man was borne by 4. That's when they let him down through the roof. 4 friends held him, carried him, suspended him. Mark 2:9 says, "Arise, take up your bed and walk." John 5:10 says, "It is not lawful for you to carry your bed on the Sabbath day." Now, all of these cases and some 36 others have the sense of lifting, carrying, bearing, and if we were to apply it to this passage, it would throw a different light on it altogether. Not only that, but the word purges is kathairo, from which we get our word catharsis, and it means to cleanse, to make clean. It's repeated again in the 3rd verse where it says you are clean through the word. It's the same word. Both the NIV and the NASB have the word prunes, which once again may fit with our imaginary picture of the husbandman dressing the vine, but is nevertheless not a translation of this particular word. If we make the words of the Scripture say what we think they ought to say, then we're not translating at all. We're prostrating the text to our own imagination. And unfortunately, that's what happens very often. I'm not saying what Jesus had in mind. Who would know that for certain? What I am saying is that if the branches are all in him, he says, "Every branch in me," if the branches are all in him, as he says that they are, then they're all Christians. And if we stick to the literal meaning of the words that Jesus used,